Do we have the answer? Answer? Yes, thank you for venturing forth.
I'm just guessing he wished to have his dream or his vision.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Very good, very close. Not right, but very close. No, that's terrible. You can tell I was never a teacher. I would never succeed. No, you actually you're on the right track. You're on the right track, and that's further than most people go, because when most people answer it, they still get stuck in the same place. They get stuck in thinking restitutional, right? We've talked about in here sort of the way we look at narrative and the way we look at our stories. Fix it, fix it, fix it, fix it. So you kind of go for the immediate thing, and that's much more open, because you said he wished for what he saw. Now the question is, what did he see? Yeah. So another quick. I didn't. That's right. That's right. I just stumped. I just left you to figure it out. Yeah. Yeah.
I wish that everybody would have what they needed.
Everybody would have what they would need, and that too is a great answer. I failed to mention at the very beginning that he said you can't wish that everybody would just be happy. You can't do the beauty queen response. The wish for everything to be good. But it is a great response. Boy, don't we use that most of the time anyway in so many different ways, right? We do that. Yeah, what do you think?
Everybody have more time.
Everybody have more. Oh, that's out of the box. Yeah, that's out of the box. I like that. That's never been suggested. I've done this all over the country for years and years. I like that. Everybody have more time. Nice. Yeah, I wonder if that could be fun to play with. But anyway, that wasn't what he wished for, but that was because, again, it was very specific to the problem. I'll give one more guess, and I'm going to answer it so we can move along here, but it fits into what we're talking about. Yes? Sorry?
He wished to be a wizard himself.
He wished to be a wizard himself. That kind of plays into the no wishing for more wishes. Yeah, but yeah, that would be good. Yeah, I should be much more specific. The wizard's like, not this, not that, not that, not that. Okay, all right, I'm going to tell you. He said, the old man said, I wish to see my great-great-grandchildren playing with me on the front lawn of our fine home. You're going, that's cheating. He simply saw the whole thing and wished for what he saw. But it didn't stop there, because you remember what he said in the very beginning. He was always happy. So he had his sight, and he had his great-grandchildren, and he sold his house and gave the money away and moved back to a smaller space. But that's kind of what this story is all about. It's about how we see things. It's about how we envision things. Now, my grandfather, if you read my blog, my grandfather was a doctor, and he was an old-school farm kind of doctor, even though he was here in Fort Worth and went to what was originally the Fort Worth School of Medicine, which is now off of, what's that, and I'm going to forget. No, it's actually not even there. It's much older than that. You can find it over there right off behind, just on the south side of Camp Bowie. It's kind of a small brown building, but that was where he first studied medicine before going on to Galveston and elsewhere. But he was basically a country doctor, and he had a farm outside of town. And as I said in the blog, he did a lot of work for the railroad company, just a lot of gratis work, and just gave that, and often said that was because you never know who's going to be helping you in the future. Everyone's our neighbor, and I help my neighbor. And in spite of what I would protest, that I didn't know how was that your neighbor, because I knew they lived over near Westover Hills, it turns out, of course, that they had many more connections in their history than they realized, and in their future than they realized. You'll have to read the blog to find that out if you didn't read it. But my grandfather was simple. He was simple, and he really was. I almost hesitate to say this, but it's 11:11, so I'm going to say it. His cure for almost any basic illness was an enema. So you know that my brothers never went to him just because we decided to be sick that day. The other thing about him was he had a nurse whose name was Carol Lucky, and Carol Lucky had been a retired military sergeant. And she was sweet as can be, but she gave shots kind of old school, as if she worked with wildlife. The first thing you do is you numb the skin, and then you poke it in there. And so that's what she'd do. She'd pinch it, and then slap it, and then stick the needle in there. And my grandfather would always come out to the visits, when we get there for the visit, and he'd say, who's going to get lucky today? And we just, that was not funny at all. When we go to the farm with my grandfather, we had an old 1957 Harvester International pickup that was just rattling. He drove an Impala. So he lived over in this neighborhood, but again, just simple, right? What was his vision? How did he see his world? That he just lived simply? Well, some of it has to do with his generation, obviously. We know that, but it's more than that, because again, that's a way of seeing the world. And so he drove a simple Impala. His wife, my grandmother, she drove a Buick, and they were both nothing fancy. And then he had this beat-up pickup, and the muffler rattled on the thing. And half the time when we were going out to the farm, which was out in Everman, which was way out in the country in those days, this was back in the late 60s, it would invariably fall off. And my uncle would, shout and cuss. And he never cussed. He always kind of invented words like squirrel spit and monkey spat and all this kind of stuff. And he'd just sort of lose it. And then he'd get out of the car, and he'd go back in the back, and he'd dig around in the pickup bed, pull out baling wire, and then wire the muffler back, right? Which, if you go look at my little Honda right now, you'll see that is amazing. It works perfectly. Just turn up the radio to drown out the rattle. So we went on down the road again, and we're driving down the road, and after, we'd hit that bump, the thing came loose, and I'm going, "You just wired it up, Granddaddy?" And he said, "Yep. Baling wire fixed a lot of things." And I said, well, Granddaddy, how long is that going to last? And he'd look over and he'd say, "Till the next bump." And then we'd have to, fix it again sometime down the line. But that was his you'd think that that's a perfect vision, right? Improvisation is a great skill to have. It's a great skill to have. We all want to have that ability to sort of deal with what happens, deal with what life throws at us, wire it together if we have to. But there's this other side of my grandfather's vision that was still bigger than that. How he looked at the world. This idea in which everyone somehow, in spite of our upbringing, is our neighbor. Part of that was his church, certainly, some of that, certainly. But also part of that was just the reality of his existence in his lifetime. And that's what I think this story is about. It's about how we look at things, how we see the world. I mean, if we look at it as a miracle story, we miss the point. All right? First of all, it's in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is all about mysticism. It's 120 years written after Christ's life. It's a whole different orientation to understanding who Christ was. It's a mystical kind of gospel. And the story up the front here about this miracle is so much more, because it just throws in your face things that shouldn't be there. The overabundance of purification jars. They wouldn't be there. First of all, it's a Judean wedding. But it says something else. But they're there, right? If you're going to go to a wedding, like so many rituals and ceremonies and sacraments, you're going to purify before you go in. But here's this overabundance of that. And then there's wine, of course, because there's supposed to be wine there. But then the strangest thing happens. Jesus takes the purification water, essentially says, "Go fill the jars," which means what? They emptied the water. They emptied the purification water and filled it up with plain water, brought it in, and it was suddenly wine. And it wasn't just wine. I forget the Greek word, but it's like the best wine ever. It's just this amazing wine. It's the same word that they use in a story that used to be circulated around in those days, up through the 1st century and into the 2nd century. And prior to Jesus' time, this idea of what is the kingdom. For this Jewish idea, eschatological idea, what is the kingdom? And it was thought of as a vine. But this vine was so amazing, this vine was composed of 1,000 other grapevines. And each 1,000 of those grapevines, each of those 1,000 had 10,000 clumps of grapes on them. And each of those clumps of grapes represented more grapes. And then each one of those grapes, when they were smashed, they became the most amazing, delicious, heavenly wine possible. That's the kingdom. So Jesus takes those urns, those jars, fills them with plain water, and creates this vision of the kingdom. And then serves everyone. And everyone is served. The playing field is completely leveled. What used to keep some out has completely been destroyed. Now everybody's part of the party. That's the vision. It's hard for us, I think sometimes, to get ourselves around this vision of just what that would mean, this idea of grapes within grapes within grapes and more grapes, and just how rich those grapes are, unless you're a scientist. And maybe if you've been a quantum scientist, or if you're a quantum scientist, you begin to explore some of that, because you realize now that we're able to get beyond simply nuclear physics and simply getting beyond the atomic level, and we get into the subatomic level, and then we get past the subatomic level, and we go, oh my gosh, there's a whole much more there. And then we get into the subatomic particles and the quarks and all of this, and then we find out there's this dark matter, and what is that? And we just keep getting further and further and further in and realize just how amazing this is. And then you saw some time back, I think I showed it in here once, that amazing shot of the Hubble telescope, which had been out in space, right? And it had been pointed in one direction for a number of years, because it has to focus. I mean, things travel in light years. Light comes to us over a long period of time. And suddenly, what was a hole of darkness, just a tiny, minuscule little space of darkness in the panoply of stars, suddenly revealed a whole other menagerie of solar systems in that tiny spot of darkness. It's always just when we think we know, there is so much more. And that's the hard thing to grasp, especially today in our culture, because we act on more of what we know, or what we think we know, right? We tend to act more on what we think we know. So our fears, our judgments, our politics, our investments, everything's sort of invested on what we think we know, and it's not invested on this reality that is so much bigger, that we would love to be able to remind everybody, hey, there's grapes upon grapes upon grapes. And if you just taste one, you're going to just be addicted. You're going to be overwhelmed with this amazement. And that's the challenge, is trying to get to that place from here. Part of it, I think, is in our thinking and in our media. I don't want to blame media, because it's really our thinking. I want to read this poem by Rainier Maria Wilkie. I love his writings. And this is a short little poem called A Walk. My eyes already touch the sunny hill, going far ahead of the road I have begun, so we are grasped by what we cannot grasp. My eyes already touch the sunny hill, going far ahead of the road I have begun, so we are grasped by what we cannot grasp. It has its inner light even from a distance, and it changes us even if we do not reach it. It changes us into something else, which, hardly sensing it, we already are. A gesture waves us on, answering our own wave, but we feel it as the wind in our faces. How do you describe the indescribable? How do we connect with it? There's this, I think maybe even way back, Charles Gaby, who was the director in here for so many years, used to speak of this, and we both knew of this idea because of my involvement with storytellers from the Native American communities as well. This idea of the 7 generations. Are you familiar with that? Are some of you all familiar with that? Decisions made. It's an Iroquois concept. The Iroquois were very influential in even our constitutional ideas and concepts there. The way in which they formed their nation had a lot of influence in the way in which the Constitution was thought through. And the Iroquois nation has this concept, which was the 7th generation. Your decisions are based on 7 generations. They're not based on today. The decisions that precede you were based on 7 generations. I want to get quickly 7 volunteers. Just 7 volunteers. Come on up here. I just need 7 people to stand up here with me. What? In the back row, somebody's willing to come up. Thank you very much for making the first leap. Yes, indeed. I'm not going to quiz you. I'm not going to make fun of you. You're not going to have to make animal sounds or animal movements, all right? So I just need 3 more. I got 1, 2, and 3. Thank you. Okay. And it's a little crowded in here, so just kind of come over here and then face as much forward as you can from there. Okay, now imagine 7 generations. How many years is that? How many years is 7 generations? Roughly 125 to 140, depending on if you go a generation 25, 30 years. So if we start right here with Ann, and today is your birthday, and you're just born.
I'm feeling very young.
Good, okay. So we go down the line, and Ann, you're born, so you are father.
Papa.
And then your grandfather, your great-grandmother, your great-great-grandmother. Try to imagine, if you can, your own relatives or your own familiarity with relatives and people in your family that many generations back. Your great-great-great-grandfather. And you're somewhere back in 1865. And you are the great-great-great-great-grandmother. Now imagine, look at this. I mean, imagine the 7 generations just to this point. Linda and I were trying to get our heads around this because she can think of her great-great-grandmother who was alive at the time that her mother knew her great-great-grandmother, so that would have been her great-great-great-grandmother. But her mother actually knew her great-great-grandmother. So from that point until Linda's child's birth, there was almost the whole 6 generations. Now, her great-great-great-grandmother had died before our first son, Tim, was born. But up until that point, her mother had knowledge of 6 generations in the family within herself. Think about what was happening in 1865, right? In the U.S., the Civil War, just prior to that, the Emancipation Proclamation, and in between 65 and 90, the assassination of Lincoln. Farming techniques were adopted and created, and the western frontier had opened up, and the whole country was buried. I can't think of the right word, but buried in Reconstruction, right? So, and then we come to 1890 to about 1915, and think of what's happening during that period of time: invention of flight, the Industrial Revolution, trains. Transcontinental trains, basically cities and factories and things moving inward. And the West basically was falling out. And the whole idea of the Western frontier. Then we come 1915. War dominates during that time to 1925. 1925 to 1940. We got the Great Crash, but then we also have rebuilding. And by the time we get into the 50s, the U.S. economy is rebuilding. But think of what's happening this whole time with civil rights. I didn't mention back here in 1890 to 1915, Ku Klux Klan was created. Between 1901 and 1910, there had been 1,000 lynchings. Now we're talking about terrorism, right? Between 1901 and 1910, 1,000 lynchings. Ku Klux Klan. So, I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on that makes up who we are and our psyche as a country, not just to mention our families. And then by the time we get into the 1940s to 1965, we're getting into the Vietnam War, we're getting into a time of prosperity, but we're also getting into a time of great disparity because the economic disparity is getting wider, and civil rights is becoming a much stronger issue. And then we get into 1965 to 1990, and what's happening? This is our generation, right? What's happening? Vietnam. Technology. I want my MTV. MTV, that's right. The spacewalk. I forgot the moon already down here. We'd already landed on the moon. March on Washington. I mean, it's interesting when we think about our lives, we rarely think in terms of where we were, where we've been, and where we are now. Even if you talk about, do you remember when you first had your first cell phone? It's kind of mind-boggling. It feels like it was in another lifetime. How many of you actually had the big boxes? You know, as the battery, it weighed 25 pounds, and you had to carry it around, and it had like 50 feet, signal. Remember those? What do we call them? We call them car phones, right? I had one of those. Yeah, and who in here had the first Mac? I did. Come on, raise your hand. Who had the? No? Aren't you sorry we didn't invest?
Yes.
My father-in-law, my wife's husband, was going like, "This is awesome," and we were looking at that ugly little disgusting box compared to the other computers out there, and like, yeah, really, this is awesome. It's barely as good as my typewriter. And he's like, "This is going to break the whole. This is going to break the whole tech." The tech envelope. And of course, he didn't invest in it either, but, But we bought one. I think they cost close to $3,000 back then, or $2,000. They were outrageous back then for that day. Life is interesting because we rarely think in terms of where things have transpired and where things are going. And imagine what they were thinking back then. How much forward thinking were they really thinking back in 1865? Your generations, your great, 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 great relatives. How much forward thinking were they putting into their life? How much forward thinking are we putting into our life? To think forward about what's happening. Thank you all. Y'all can have a seat. Thank you very much for standing up here. We can give them a hand just for standing up here. I think the biggest challenge for us in this day and age is this idea of trying to think ahead. I mean, if you think about it, how many of us, and you may not be, you're a pretty enlightened group in here, so I'll go ahead and say that you weren't there, but how many of our folks in our culture, in our society, were just completely immersed in the lottery this past week? Right? How much was it? Most of us know that. Who's the Speaker of the House? You know how much money was in the lottery more than you know who the Speaker of the House. That's true. That's going to be true for most people in our country. You know, the reality is we're imprisoned by our own limitations, by our own short stories, our own short-sightedness. And yet, what this story is about, at the very beginning of this mystical Gospel of John, is that, by the way, let me tell you what this is all about is huge. This is a big, grand vision. This is a big, immense kingdom of which we are a part, and God wants you to partake in it, and God wants everybody to be included in it. That's what this story is about. And yet we get caught up in the small and really get lost. And here's a thought I want to give you before I finish up. You have a better chance. It occurred to me. I'll say me. I have a better chance of having a famous biography written about me than winning the lottery. You have a better chance of having a famous bestseller biography written about you than you do of winning the lottery. Did you know that? Had you ever thought of that? That's a big story. That's thinking about the big story. That's finding myself where I am and thinking about the future I can make a difference in, the bigger picture I can participate in, the bigger part of God's kingdom, which is inclusive, which is loving, which is compassionate. That's the bigger place I can find my story and make a difference and be, even if I'm not recognized or famous, I can make a difference. If your only vision is to get the money, I can guarantee, and you can check it out on the research, most of those folks don't make much difference. Because they find out it's a short story. Even if it's $1 billion, it's a short story. For most of them. You got to have a bigger vision before you begin anything. Ask ourselves, what part of this, what story are we a part of as we live our lives day to day? Amen.